Even though it might not seem like it, going back to the bubble in 2020, the Miami Heat have been unquestionably one of the most successful teams in the entire NBA.
Bach at 7, working against Butler, got downhill, couldn't punch it. Now it's Butler driving, Butler hanging, Butler hitting a 40-point game 3.
2 finals appearances, 3 conference finals appearances, a ton of great playoff moments, and you could easily argue that among the franchises that haven't won a title in the last 5 years, they have been the best. But that 5-year mark is really important here because it aligns directly with the arrival of Jimmy Butler from Philadelphia. Back in the summer of 2019, Butler was an unrestricted free agent after just 1 season with the Sixers, and above all else, was looking for his next big NBA contract. Not getting that deal was a big part of him leaving Chicago in 2017 and forcing a trade from the Timberwolves in 2018, and while the Sixers had a ton of success in the 1 season that Butler was there, they famously chose to pay other guys instead of him. It's also worth noting that Jimmy for sure wanted to end up in Miami once it was clear that the Sixers thing wasn't 100%, and he pushed for that outcome because the Heat didn't even have the cap space to sign him, and so it had to be a sign and trade, which he had to tell the Sixers who to trade him to, and they did. In one of the most unbelievable trades to look back on now, the Heat added Jimmy Butler, a player that they could not have signed outright as a free agent, in exchange for Josh Richardson and nothing else. Butler arrived in Miami going to his 4th different team in a span of 2 years, and more than anything else that we're going to talk about in this video, he has been the reason for the success of the Heat ever since he arrived. But his time in Miami might be coming to an end soon, and with it, this era of Heat basketball. Because as great as Butler is and has been, he's far from perfect. He has a long history of causing issues to get what he wants, going back to Chicago, going back to Minnesota, and it wouldn't be surprising at all to see him do the same thing with the Heat.
Before I say this sentence, do you think I'm just that hard to work with?
Jimmy wants a new contract just like he did in 2019 when he left the Sixers, and so far, the Heat have been reluctant to give him one. To Butler, it seems like he should just get another max or close to it given his success in the playoffs, but the Heat see things differently. And Pat Riley has made that very clear.
If you're not on the court playing against Boston or on the court playing against the New York Knicks, you should keep your mouth shut.
The reality is Butler does not have the same leverage now that he did back in 2019. He isn't the same player, and maybe more importantly, he just isn't very durable. If he had played 70 plus games a season for the last few years, I bet that he would be much more willing to give him a new deal and keep him out of free agency, but that just isn't the reality. Whether it be not taking the regular season seriously, which really has been a thing for Miami as a team, not just Butler, or the increased injury concerns that come with aging into his mid-30s, or something else, it's going to be difficult to convince the Heat to just sign up for another massive Jimmy Butler contract if he can't stay healthy. If the Heat gave Butler the contract that he wants, they'd essentially be locking themselves in to this core that they've had the last couple of years, which yes, has been successful, but doesn't have much of an avenue to improve and get better while the rest of the East continues to get better around them. But that isn't stopping Butler from trying to create some leverage for himself anyway. As much as we can talk about contract values and injuries, the Heat just losing Butler for nothing in free agency in 2025 would be a massive loss for them and likely change the direction of their franchise. As nice as some of the other pieces are on the roster, namely Bam Adebayo, without a star presence like Butler, they're just a play-in team at best. So even if the Heat don't love the contract, they are faced with a tough choice. Let Butler walk and potentially go into a rebuild, which puts the future of Bam and others in question, or just suck it up, sign Butler to a deal that makes sense for both sides, and make a few more pushes for a deep playoff run. And the biggest thing that could put the Heat in that situation of having to make that choice is if Butler had another team that he could point to and say, you don't want to pay me, fine, then I will go here. And right now, here looks like the Brooklyn Nets. In a classic offseason news dump, there have been rumors swirling recently that Butler has real interest in signing with the star-hungry Brooklyn Nets, setting them up as not only real competition to steal Butler away from Miami, but also as just the kind of leverage that he needs to secure a new deal from the Heat. Now, what we don't know is if the Nets have any real interest in bringing in Butler themselves. All of the same durability and contract concerns that the Heat have would surely apply to Brooklyn as well, and they certainly aren't in a place roster-wise to be adding stars. They just dumped talent this offseason to get their own picks back and are clearly aiming for a high lottery pick in the 2025 draft. And even if they get the first pick and add some pieces, Butler does not seem like a natural fit with their timeline at all. That doesn't mean that it won't happen, just that it doesn't make a ton of sense right now. And that a lack of a free agency market for Jimmy Butler in 2025 seems to be what the Heat are counting on right now. Similar to when James Harden tried to use the Houston Rockets as leverage when he left the Sixers last offseason, Butler seems to be trying to create leverage by just using one other team. But if that team goes away, like the Rockets did when they changed course and signed Fred VanVleet instead, then suddenly Butler is left without options, which means that we likely aren't getting a resolution to this situation anytime soon, and it could certainly lead to Jimmy Butler either on a different team on a big contract in 2025 or just leaving the Heat for another team, even on a smaller deal, because he's upset with how Miami handled his contract. And if that happens, what's next for the Heat? They have young talent, Jaime Jaquez, Tyler Hero, Bam Adebayo. It's a nice core to try and build something around, but again, it likely falls apart against good teams without the star presence of Butler, and none of those guys look to have another level to go up that would make up for the loss of Butler, especially in the postseason. And in that scenario, I would expect the Heat to do what they always do, go star hunting. They have the assets to make a deal work should a star become unhappy and available, and if we know anything about the modern NBA, it is that that will probably happen. And in that situation, should the Heat keep Bam around, they have the perfect infrastructure to lure a star right back into the void created by Butler leaving. And even if you think that won't be enough, if the Heat added Trae Young or Donovan Mitchell or Damian Lillard or whoever to this team without Butler, that wouldn't be enough to make any real difference over the current version of the team, you'd probably be right. But that's never really mattered to the Heat. They aren't a franchise that rebuilds really. They just continue to change pieces and try and remain competitive. And to their credit, that's worked over the last 5 years, and there's no reason to expect that they would change their mindset if Butler left. Which means that all of this is a real possibility, as much as at any point during Butler's tenure in Miami, him leaving the team is not only a real possibility, but also something that is going to hang over the Heat all season long. If they get off to a bad start, or they have some injury issues, or if Butler doesn't play much or seems unhappy, things can unravel quickly, which could result in the most interesting, for content at least, outcome of all of this, a mid-season Butler trade. What if he tells the Heat he's leaving at the end of the year and they're 10 games under 500 at the trade deadline? They kind of have to move him, right? Maybe the Lakers or Clippers or some other team come calling with some assets. The Heat would have to listen to offers at that point. And whatever you think about Butler at this stage of his career, he would be a massive piece to move mid-season as we went towards the playoffs. Now, all of that is interesting, but I might be getting ahead of myself. The reality is, right now, Jimmy Butler's on the Heat, and that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. But we all know that things can change quickly in the NBA, especially with Jimmy Butler.
Before I say this sentence, do you think I'm like just that hard to work with?